like always, please never just believe me. Never just assume it's true because I say so. Search the scriptures. Let the Bible have the final say. Life, as we understand it, cannot survive without water. It's the first thing we look at in other planets to see if there's some form of sustainable life. My body contains roughly 16 gallons. Some of you are much smaller in mass, so you'll contain a little bit less, but you get the idea. It accounts for about half of the bone weight, 64% of the skin, 73% of my brain and heart, and 83% of my lungs are all water. In short, I need it to live. It lubricates joints, digests food, controls my temperature. It's the foundation for my cells and insulates my brain, my spinal column, my organs. It flushes toxins and waste. I really do need it to live. And God built within me, as a result of this, because I lose water, we all lose water, God built within us an involuntary system, as he does with all things that are crucial for survival, to make sure that that water would be replenished. When you lose 1% of your water, that's roughly the weight of an inflated football. In my case, that would be roughly about 2.5 cups. Everything starts to wane. Physical, mental performances start to wane. Things like osmolytes, like salts, start to concentrate in my body, of course, because the water's no longer there to flush them through. And they start preparing, my body starts preparing the thirst process. I can't lose more than 2% of my body water without me starting to suffer in ways that cause erosion in my systems. You need it to live. And thus you start to see when people start to suffer from dehydration. And there are certain things that, ironically, and here's a classic example, alcohol, and I'm not here for the moment to bang the pulpit about it, but one of the things alcohol does is it dehydrates you. There is an irony to that. Because you're putting liquid into your system, but ironically, that which you're putting into your system is actually having the counterattack, or it's counter to what it is you're actually trying to accomplish, which is replenishing the water in your system. And everything from your motor skills to your cognitive processes, ultimately, even by the point you get to 3% of the water in your system being lost, it will cause seizures, your organs will start to fail, you will start to die. Because inside you, God knew that water was crucial for you to live. I find it fascinating how brilliant God is that when you start to lose water to some degree, where the body starts pulling in for replenishing, the place where God sends the most obvious effects to it is your mouth. The one place that actually gets the water replenished naturally, or I should say at least that we kind of do naturally. It isn't like it's just like our feet start to itch or our heads feel kind of, hot. It's like our mouths get dry because God's like, no, feed me, Seymour. There's that aspect that we need water in that. Well, I'd like you to consider the fact that in that same way that you're not just a physical being. You are a spiritual being. Dogs are not spiritual beings. Deer are not spiritual beings. They may appear to have personalities, but they do not have a will. Contrary to, maybe there may be the sense of you're trying to tell it not to poop in your house, and it still does. But in regards to it, it's not held accountable, and pardon me for saying it isn't like you're actually Hachi is not waiting for you in heaven right now. And the only reason I say that is we are unique of all the creations on the planet to being that which actually has a soul. Or might I say this way, you are a soul that is encased in this tent that you call your human body. Now that body has involuntary systems that try to replenish the things that it needs to survive. But I would say your spirit does too. In that same way, if you think about it, there is a thirst, an annoying ache, this chronic haunting, this thing inside of me that's driving. And what happens is that I try to fill it. I'm desperate to fill it. And every bit of loneliness and all admirations and achievements and amassments and amusements all revolve around the idea of me drinking something spiritually that actually is making me more thirsty than actually solving the problem. And if it was something that could be replenished once and for all, well, then it would be something that would actually be an eternal answer. But because we have to constantly be replenishing it, that tells me that there's a temporariness to these satiations, and that's where the problem is. Now, on your physical sense, that makes sense because your body's physical. Your body is stuck under the laws of entropy. In other words, it starts to erode, like it or not. You will have a day where you'll be at the top of the mountain, and from that point down, you will be rolling down it. Now, I can comfortably tell you that I am rolling down the hill. Some of you are walking up. Some of us are down farther on that hill than others. But we'll all have a day where, if we can just put it as nice as we can, you are as pretty as you're going to be. But then after that, you will spend the rest of your time trying to stay as close to the top of the hill as you can. And you can nip and tuck and cut and suck and do whatever you want, but in the end of it all, we're still fighting entropy, and it's going to win sooner or later. And your pecs wind up in your belly sooner or later. It's like all the hair that's on your head just may start growing out of your nose, but in the end, gravity does win. And there are things that constantly need replenishing. On that same way, I can put it this way, is I'm contemplating this, and one of the places that I've gone as of recent is to Starbucks. And I'm not necessarily, my biggest reason for liking Starbucks is what it does to my wife. But in this particular case, I've had the opportunity, it's one of the few places where you can sit and actually do your work around here. A lot of the places here, it's sort of like you kind of go in, get your fix, they mainline you, and off you go. But this is one of those places where you can kind of sit. And I really like to study the Word with my Bible, Old Faithful open, so people kind of go, oh, he's one of those guys. And I like to do that in public places. It gives me into conversations with people. It allows me to kind of introduce myself from a distance, if that makes sense. But it also, because I don't want to sort of study this stuff insulated in a cave without realizing the people that I want to seek to minister to around me. And in a situation like this, I'm observing. And I'm a big people watcher. People fascinate me because they're the coolest show on earth, in my opinion. But you watch, there are different kinds of people who show up at a coffee shop. I'll say, I don't want to say which one I actually go to, at least in this case, but it rhymes with Barbucks. Anyways, but I'm there, and you can watch. There are people that are kind of they're the casuals. They kind of pop in, and they're kind of there. And usually they're the kind of people that, they're kind of jovial. In other words, they don't seem like there's a lifeline needed. And then there are those, by the way, who are there socially. They're there and they're going to be meeting other people, and it's like it's a reason. It's sort of a cheap thing. You can still drive after one of these, and so they kind of meet, and it's a safe place for that. And then there are those that I would call the needers. It's like they kind of crawl in. It's like drool is still dry to the side of their face. They've got one slipper on, and they just kind of, they don't even lift their legs. They just kind of somehow magically move like on a conveyor belt on their way up. And they know everybody that works there by name. And they'd be like, Matt, I need a big one today. And it's not like I would like, there are people I would like, and it's like, I feel like it's another language because you have to speak, like 16 words. There's this, and there's this way, and it's this size, and it's this with this thing and this thing on the side of it, and you make sure that you shake it 3 times and, not stir it or whatever. But, they're like, I would like this with, soy, with this thing that, really isn't milk, because who milks an almond, for instance, And then by the time you're done, right? But then there are those that are like, they don't come up and they'd say, I'd like this. They're like, I need. And it's like there's a desperation in their voice. And I get to sit afterwards. It gets quiet after a while, and I'll get to talk to some of the people, like Matt's one of those examples, where I get to sit and talk with them. And it's like, the sad part is you just know this may get them through the morning, but it hits about 2 or 3 o'clock, and they're crashing hard. That's the problem with that. And you really kind of realize that this is really a lot of what happens spiritually with a lot of what we seek. If you try something that's eternal and you try to satiate with something that's temporary, they can't possibly work. It's not built for that. It would be like something that is only working through being plugged in, and you're trying to figure out a place to just shove batteries in it, though there's no compartment for it. And the reason I say that is that God knew how to develop that in us for a situation just like this one. Now, listen to what God says about this, because he makes this comment, this judgment about his own people in Jeremiah chapter 2. And by the way, please understand something. That if you don't know Jesus as Lord and Savior, I don't blame you. It's kind of like, it's like if all you ever knew was sort of swap meat satiations, I get the idea you'll take what you can get. I mean, Proverbs makes that really clear. It'll tell us that to the bitterest, to the satiated soul, to the satisfied soul, even the bitterest, or even the sweetest thing would be bitter. But it tells us for the starving soul, even the most bitter thing is sweet. But the satiated soul loathes the honeycomb is the literal translation. But this is what God says in Jeremiah chapter 2:13 about his own people. He says, my people have committed two evils. Well, they've forsaken me, the fountain of living waters. And they've hewn for themselves cisterns, broken cisterns, that can hold no water. God bless you. Does anyone know what a cistern is? God bless you. It's obviously, a cistern is the female version of brethren. No, that's not it. God bless you. A cistern, in a simple sense, is a big water tank, usually dug underground, collecting. God bless you.
Sorry.
It's all right. She's allergic to the cistern jokes. They are quite substantial. They are quite substantial. In some cases, much larger than what we would have as a water tower. Remember those? Some of us older folk remember those old water towers. And there is one, by the way, near Gordon's tomb in Jerusalem. That is, it is so large that it is several stories deep. I'm going to give you an idea. And you would collect rainwater, of course, and you would use that water and so forth. But if it's broken, then obviously it can't even hold the water. Now understand what God says in Jeremiah chapter 2, and this is fundamental, is he says there's two problems here. The first is they've abandoned me, and the second is they've tried to replace me with this. Now, he's not saying that to the lost world out there, the people who have no understanding or no history with God or no experience with God. He's talking about people, he's like, you should know better. Those people, I don't expect them to know better. And you can see when God starts talking to Jonah and he goes off on Jonah, he says, these people, man, they don't know, they just don't even know right from wrong, really. He goes, but you should know better. He goes, man, living water. Could you imagine going 200 or 2,000 years ago and sitting down and talking to people about plumbing? Now, the Romans and Greeks had developed something primarily for the removal of waste. But the idea of them, could you imagine the witchcraft they would think it is for you to walk in and turn on a faucet in your house? And not only that it would be water, but water that you would be, which would be infinitely safer than anything they understood to drink. You would be confident that probably it's extremely unlikely that a cow was pooping in your water on the way through the faucet. So please understand, when he's talking here about living water, as we'll see here, living water was not like the church sat down and said, let's invent some really cool Christian terms. It'll look good on a t-shirt, it'll come out really cool in a couple of worship songs. There was only two kinds of water in the world. There's stagnant water and there's moving water. Stagnant water, great for birthing, pond scum. It's a perfect incubator for mosquitoes. In other words, really nasty things happen in still water. And then there's running water, which, by the way, is, according to Scripture, called living water. The reason I say that is if you understood that before before the church adopts that term, you get the idea that it would be everything we would want is living water. We would want something that would be able to actually be safer, that would obviously, but if you're thirsty, you'll drink pond scum. If that's what, and the only reason I say that is that God is saying in Jeremiah, he goes, my people have committed this. Let's just be honest. If he were to look at the churches, I wonder how much he would see. I wonder how much he would see where he would say, the problem is I have so much to offer them, and they are scooping up nastiness, and it can't possibly hold the water. And here I am, an endless supply. Well, if you remember at the end of the last chapter, the Pharisees had tried to pit John the Baptist against Jesus. They argued first with John the Baptist's disciples about purification, although that never seems to be the issue with John the Baptist. But with him, they're kind of going, well, everyone's going to Jesus now. And of course, John's like, that's the whole point of it. And it tells us here then that Jesus catches wind of that. He catches wind that the Pharisees have shown up over there and they're really trying to cause trouble. So what does Jesus do? He could have gone after the Pharisees. I mean, he's God in the flesh. He could have just said, all right, from this point on, let's rip the tongue out of every Pharisee. He's God. He could have done that. You should be really thankful I'm not God for a billion reasons. But one of them is I'm that kind of creative person that's like, well, we could stop this instantly. Let's just have, anyways, I won't even go there. But here's the point. Jesus knows that this is causing trouble. And so you know what he does? He actually, if you will, removes all of the ammo from the munitions closet. He just bails on this issue. And he leaves the River Jordan to head up through Galilee. So he's heading north now. He's not going to let them be able to stay this long. But what it does tell us in chapter 4, verses 1 and 2, and look at it with me. It says, therefore, when the Lord knew that the Pharisees had heard that Jesus made and baptized more disciples than John. Now, two things. Jesus made more disciples than John. He was gathering his class was larger, because remember, disciples mean students. But also, that there was more people being baptized, which, by the way, there's a huge issue in that, and that is that they were going public with it. Although, notice verse 2, Jesus didn't baptize anyone. Now, think about how cool this is, though. What this means is that Jesus made disciples and then gave them the blessing of letting them baptize each other. So there were those who walked with Jesus, and how did people wind up with Jesus? People that had followed Jesus turned and invited other people. And when they came, they were baptized, chances are, by those people. Oh, come on in, sneak on in. Buonasera. So this is where it starts. It starts with Jesus leaving this baptismal site. And the reason he leaves it is not because because he's run out of people to baptize. Jesus leaves it for one reason, apparently, according to John 4:1, and that is that people are using this to try to create division among people who are disciples. Now, I think about how many times in my younger days of walking with Christ, how it would be, how quick I would be to go after someone's jugular on something like this, and to try to chase after those people and hunt them down, instead of just kind of go, well, what can I do to sort of alleviate the problem? So what Jesus does is he heads off the radar. He realizes he's a very substantial blip on the radar of the Pharisees at this moment. He's already causing trouble as far as they're concerned. And what he does is he heads to a place that for the most part is kind of off the radar. Galilee, which in simple means circle, is in the area of the north. It is the area today that's called Galilee. It's still called Galilee today. And in essence, it is Hobunk. It is the place, it's the boonies. I mean, there's so much I could develop, kind of more technically, but let's just put it in the simplest sense, that even the people there, the way that they pronounced the language was so considered so crude that of the 365 synagogues in Jerusalem, that they were not allowed to do a benediction there because they thought it would be blasphemous because of the way they spoke. That gives you a bit of an idea. So if you could kind of think of, people that collectively, maybe the whole family collectively has one full mouth of teeth, and you get the images that come into your head, whatever those images are. Coalesce on a Friday night at Walmart, whatever. But the point is that that's the way a Galilean was viewed, which is, by the way, where Jesus is going to set up shop. Now, it tells us in this, that in verse 3, that he left Judea and departed to Galilee. Now, it is important to note that the majority of Jesus' ministry is in Galilee. However, it is not recorded that way in the Gospel of John. His focus is on the last week. From chapter 13 of John through 20, that's half of his book, is going to be focused, if you will, on his time in Jerusalem that last week. Give you an idea, Matthew spends 72% of his time in Galilee. That's substantial. Mark, by the way, 56% of his time, more than half of it there. Luke will spend from chapter 9, verse 51 through to 19, the middle of 19, all of that's his walk down to Jerusalem. That's the fundament for Luke. But John, that's not it, but he just tells us here, Jesus left Judea and he's heading to Galilee. He's heading off the radar, and it says in verse 4, but he needed to go through Samaria. Now, that is a bit of an odd thing. First of all, because how many things do we read in Scripture that Jesus needed? And how did he need it? Did he need it because the Father gave him commandment to go through here? Was it that there was something in his own spirit that had a need, and it was for this? And by the way, according to what we're going to see, is this is for a one-on-one. Jesus does house calls, or if you will hear, Jesus does well calls. So let me give you a little bit of a visual here to kind of help things out. And hopefully this will, because I have a lot to explain, and this is why we're not going to get through the whole story today. Because to be honest, I'd rather get the depth and the beauty of this. You know, it's kind of like those really, there are some weeks where we're eating chocolate and we're really enjoying it and we're blessed. And there are some weeks it's fudge, if that makes sense, where it's like you gotta just sit and savor it and let it melt in your mouth. And I would pray that would be every week in regards to Scripture. But I want to at least start with this. During the time of King David, by the way, roughly about 1000 BC, if I can get us sort of in context. He enlarges the kingdom to a very substantial size. And that's really kind of what we have here. If you can see this, and the easiest way to kind of remember sort of boundaries are by water. We have here the Sea of Galilee, but you have here the Dead Sea. This is the Mediterranean, and just down here will be the Red. So it'll be, if you will, the Dead, the Red, and the Med. That's kind of helping us. So really, after King David, his son Solomon reigns, but King Solomon has a very divided heart. Well, part of it is that he's got 1,000 women that he's supposed to be keeping happy in his house, that some are supposed to be romantically tied to him. Now, calling him the wisest man that ever lived doesn't mean he doesn't make stupid choices, or maybe 999 stupid choices, but just the same. So this is what happens. But after Solomon, the kingdom divides. And once the kingdom divides, what will happen is, let me do it this way, is the kingdom divides this way. Solomon's commander, his name, and it's just to make things really not confusing, his commander's name is Jeroboam, but his son's name is Rehoboam. That's going to make it easy. So let's just say it this way. His commander's name was Jerry. Let's just call him that, Jeroboam, Jerry. And what will happen ultimately, though it was one of David's commanders, Solomon's, what will happen is he comes back and 10 northern tribes side with the commander. And again, that's Jeroboam. And that's this area here, and they call themselves Israel. On the south, what you have is Judah, Benjamin, the tribes of Judah and Benjamin, and the renegade Levites, and they call themselves, therefore, Judah. It's, by the way, where we get the term Jew from today, is Judah. So after Solomon, now you're looking at the 950s BC, you have the kingdom divided. So what you have here is sort of a civil war. You've got, Iron Man and, Captain Israel, whatever the case is. So that's the case. Now, if you look at Judah, what you'll find is Jerusalem is right here. And if Jerusalem is right here, you can't have two warring communities having the same capital. So ultimately what happens is that the original, does anyone know where the original capital was before the 6th king of the Northern Empire? I'd be really impressed. I'll give you a hint. It's the name of a dog. Yeah, that's even worse. It's the name of a dragoon dog.
Tirzah?
Tirzah. Excellent. Look at how brilliant you are. Yes. Tirzah. Now, to give you an idea, there are 19 kings up in the north before they're taken captive. Of the 19 kings, let me kind of give you a basic rundown of the first handful. The first guy, remember that guy, Jeroboam? He has a son who's murdered by this guy, who has a son who's murdered by this guy. Are you with me so far? And this guy we might call 1 week Zimri, because he only lasts a week, commits suicide and is replaced by a commander named Omri. That's the 6th guy. Yeah, so you get that? So it's, it's like son, murdered, suicide, and then Omri. Sounds a lot like a lot of European royalties back in the day.
Why isn't this a mini-series?
It should be, right?
This is better than Game of Thrones.
Yeah, it's meant for, it is. It's sort of like, it's not the Game of Thrones, it's like it's the Battle of Thrones, but you're right. So now get this. Now Omri decides that he's going to go and he's going to replace, so this is now we're looking lovely, and by the way, all of that takes place in 50 years, to give you an idea. So in 50 years, we are on 6th king, our 6th guy. And our 6th guy, you wouldn't know him very well because he only does one substantial thing. Of these guys up here, of the 19 kings, not a single decent one among them, but he's the only king who actually builds a city. Now there are others who fortify areas, primarily to keep people out from going into Judah, but he's the only one who builds a city. And the city that he builds, ultimately, he buys from a guy named Shemer. Now Shemer means to guard. Shemer, lesser known, is actually a super high imposed alcoholic drink. Historically, the closest thing I could tell you, if you understand, is Everclear. In other words, it's something that nobody ever goes near other than to give themselves a temporary lobotomy. That's basically the only reason you would do that. Now, interesting, this guy owns a property, a piece of land, and he buys it from this guy, Shemer, and he calls it, in essence, Shemerville. Or we might say Shemaria, from which we get the term Samaria. That's where the term is. Y'all with me on that so far? Mm-hmm. So it just happens to be the capital of the Northern Empire. Basically it. Fast forward a little bit. And again, forgive me for don't even forgive me. I'm giving you a history lesson for a good reason. I want you to know this stuff. So while all of this is happening, Judah is vacillating. They have these kind of goofy kings, and then it always seems to go back to a guy that goes, hey, we need to take back the reins and let's get back to the Lord. And you will find that happens at least 8 times. 9 times they're decent guys. And sometimes they have to do all kinds. And there's like one crazy grandma who kills her kids, spoiler alert. Hey kids, welcome to grandmother's house. Hi. And then they have to kind of boot her out so that an 8-year-old, 7-year-old can take over the throne, the only existing child left. Because they hid him in the one place they knew that grandma would never go, the temple. He's like, take a wicked woman, where do you hide someone? Church. No one's going to go there. All right, here's the point. This erodes and erodes and erodes and erodes and erodes until we're at roughly 722 BC. In 722 BC, everything really falls to pot. And what happens is that the empires have this, by the way, there was an empire over here, geographically, that almost had its own civil war and almost completely eroded into nothingness. But a guy came over here and said, 40 days and you're toast. And they repented. And as a result of that, that kingdom became a strong empire. Does anyone know what empire that is? Yeah, and Nineveh was the capital of Assyria. Does anyone know where Assyria is today? Iraq. It'll be easy to remember, if you could, because from here we go Iraq, you'll go Jordan, but then Iraq and Iran. And the easiest way to remember that is Iran so far away. All right, so it's the one that's farther. Now, what happens is Assyria, by the way, becomes this horribly cruel, nasty thing. Their repentance was very temporary. They were known for the art of skinning a person alive so quick that they could show them the entirety of their skin before they died. Quite an accomplishment, but we can all agree, sick and twisted. They were known for sticking hooks in people's mouths and dragging them off. Now, Assyria ultimately gets several campaigns. So Hadden, by the way, Tiglath-Pileser III starts. But ultimately what happens is they come in here and they conquer the land in 722, 721 BC. And when they conquer the land, one of the things the Assyrians did well is that they were excellent deporters. They were great at keeping people from rising back up. So what they did is they took the majority of the people here and moved them to Iraq. And then they took a lot of people that they had conquered from all of this land and they brought them into here. So what you have is some remaining from the 10 tribes and then a whole lot of other people from a whole lot of other places. Does that make sense so far? Mm-hmm. Now, what would you do? First of all, you can't even talk to each other. They genuinely spoke languages they didn't understand. But somehow that did not keep them. And there's like universal things like Kenny G, I guess. I mean, they put on the music and all of a sudden everyone's getting amorous and they start intermingling. Now, by the way, please understand, God has actually We do not read that God has an issue with different people from different nationalities intermingling. What he has a problem with are people with different spiritual heritages. That's the point. Now what it tells us is that these people now, so we have our people that are sort of Jewish and sort of something else, we're not even really sure. Y'all with me so far? But I'm going to read to you a text to sort of kind of help put things into perspective. And if you can find it in your Bible, I'd love for you to go there. And that's in 2 Kings chapter 17. And I want you to listen carefully for a specific word that may stand out. In 2 Kings chapter 17, now we're getting the end of that situation where they're being deported and so forth. And it says this now in verse 22. For the children of Israel walked in the sins of Jeroboam. By the way, and we'll talk about that another time, which he did, and they did not part from them, until the Lord removed Israel out of his sight, as he had said by his servants the prophets. By the way, right before the people were taken captive, God turns up the heat. What you'll find is God will always be sending prophets to kind of go, hey, you're whack on God here. You're getting really whack. But right before it's closing time, God brings in the heat. And he brings in lots. What he does is he upscales to the intensity of the prophets, and he also brings in more of them. He sort of intensifies not just the power of them, but also, in that sense, the amount of them. You'll find that will happen in your own life right before fall. God will bring more people to sort of warn you and to step in and go, hey, you do know you're acting crazy, right? Until the point where you just have to be completely out of your mind to continue in the direction you're heading. So this is what God says. So he brought by the servant of his prophet. So Israel was carried away from their own land to Assyria, as it is to this day. Then the king of Assyria brought people from Babylon, from Kutah, from Ava, from Hamat, and from Sepharvaim. You go, oh, of course, he would bring them from Sepharvaim. That's, by the way, basically what we're talking about is we're spanning down from Saudi Arabia today, all the way through the Gulf Coast, and all the way up to the northern ends of Iraq and Iran. Give you an idea. And he placed them in Samaria instead of the children of Israel, and they took possession of Samaria and dwelt in their cities. And so it was at the beginning of their dwelling there that they did not fear the Lord. Of course they didn't fear the Lord. They didn't even know him. Therefore the Lord sent lions among them, which killed some of them. Now, please understand, general mindset of Middle Eastern godhood is that every god was territorial. And we'll find that, by the way, when Israel fights certain people, like, for instance, the Syrians, they'll say, oh, well, he's the god of the hills, so we should fight him in the valleys. And God goes, well, I'll show you what. Because they said I was only the God of the hills, I'm going to whoop them in the valley. So they'll know I'm the God who can whoop you anywhere. And so understand that they're kind of going there, and they're kind of going, well, I don't know who the new God is. So it says, so they spoke to the king of Assyria, saying, the nations whom you have removed and placed in the cities of Samaria do not know the rituals of the God of the land, therefore he has sent lions among them, and indeed they are killing them because they do not know the rituals of the God of the land. Then the king of Assyria commanded them, saying, send one of the priests whom you brought from here, let them go and dwell there, and let him teach them the rituals of the God of the land. So one of the priests whom they carried away to Samaria came and dwelt in Bethel, and taught them how they should fear the Lord. However, every nation continued to make gods of its own, and put them in the shrines on the high places which Samaritans had made, every nation in the cities which they dwell. Now all of a sudden we have this term Samaritans. So what you have is, you have this area where all of these people who obviously that weren't Jewish, who didn't know the Lord, who didn't fear the Lord, they were getting mauled, so they said, you know what the problem is? They don't know the rituals. If we could teach them the rituals, this would stop. Now, I'd like you to consider something here. How unique it is to be a Christian. I didn't want to be a Christian, I'll be honest. Because what I saw was plastic, cheap, shallow, and superficial. Before I actually knew what real Christianity was. I was 19. And I investigated everything I could, but there's something that kept standing out to me. And forgive me if you will, but I'm going to develop it with this particular story. Several years ago, I had the blessing of being able to go to India. we took a scouting team of 6 people to go and investigate ministries, as we tended to do traditionally, to see the validity of it, how they handle things and so forth. But specifically a man who in essence was a militant, anti-missionary Hindu. I didn't know that such people existed, to be honest. And he basically trained a group of mercenaries to go and beat up Christian pastors. Until one day he met Jesus himself, and very much like Paul did in Acts chapter 9. And ultimately then, the best part is he's running from all of the men that he's taught to beat people up because they're all trying to kill him now. Probably a lot like Saul was back in his day. So we went and investigated, but my first day landing there was a couple things that really impressed upon me. One is people were bathing in urine. Never really saw that before. Second, of course, how stiflingly hot it was. But third, that there was a shrine literally on every street corner. Kind of like where you would put a sign that says no U-turn, there was a shrine. But the most astounding thing from the initial landing in the place was the sight of an elderly man, likely in his 90s, we were in Calcutta, who was naked rolling down a hill. Now, how do you ask questions without being culturally insensitive? Like, does this kind of happen all the time with you guys? Is this normal behavior? How do you ask that without sounding weird? Or at least culturally insensitive. So I just, I tried to ask. I'm like, well, first of all, is this man doing this intentionally? Is there someone that's going to intervene? They're like, oh, no. The situation's natural. And I'm like, but there are pieces of broken glass and stuff before him. And they're like, he actually put them there. I'm like, so my first thought, of course, is there is some form of dishealth with this man mentally, that it would be putting harm in his own way. I'm like, why is he doing this? Well, Calcutta is named after a god they have there called Kali. And Kali is a god of destruction. And the man who was explaining to me, by the way, was our handler, who wasn't, by the way, even Christian, was telling us he was doing this to keep Kali away. And it struck me. I'm like, well, let me ask you a question. Of the 300 million gods you have, how many of them do you perform acts of worship to keep them away? And he says, well, friend, all of them. And it really struck me. How many religions out there, people do their acts of worship, in essence, to keep an angry, vengeful, wrathful God away. And that's it. And by the way, the church could get messed up in that. And there have been historical periods of time where the church has been more caught up in trying to basically keep this guy away than to celebrate the intimacy of a God who gave his only son to purchase us so that we would have nothing between us of our own guilt or shame or filth. How unique it is to celebrate a God not to keep him away and not even to draw him near, but rather because we're his, because he is near, because he loves us anyways. Can you realize how spoiled we are with that? God bless you as well. Well, I don't know what's on that couch there, but I'm glad I'm not. I mean, do you realize we're the only people on the planet who actually get to wake up every morning and not have to wonder whether our God still wants us? Do you realize that? And if anyone were to call us self-righteous, nothing could be further than the truth. Or from the truth, because we're the only people who aren't self-righteous. We're Christ-righteous. Jesus made us right? It isn't how many times I pray, how many times I make a hajj, how many kind gifts I do, how many mikvahs, whatever the case is. It's like, how many times I make sure that I've crawled up steps with beans and so forth. That's stuff you do yourself. Isn't that self-righteous? And if you're doing it yourself, if it's relying on you or relying on me, man, we're stuck. Because that means what happens when we have a bad day? Well, then we're going to have to do more right things to try to outweigh it. I'm not self-righteous, I'm Christ-righteous. He's the one who did it all to make me right. Now, here's the point in all of that. Getting back to this, and again, this is why we're not going very far yet, is the Samaritans were people who, hear me, did everything we did. They did the rituals. They learned the rituals. But for the very wrong reasons. Do you know people like that? They'll go to church because they want to have a good week. They'll pray because they don't want to get hit by a car. And they live in fear that if they don't read enough, pray enough, go to church enough, whatever the case, then it's bound to be a bad week. Well, in fairness, it's going to be a worse week, but it isn't because God's punishing you, because you're going to be a nastier person if you're not spiritually charged. Is that fair? But you realize, I don't ever have to go on a date with my wife. I get to go on a date with my wife. It isn't like, well, if I don't go on a date with my wife, she's just going to be cranky and that whole house is going to be more miserable. How lame would that relationship be? Can we treat God that way? So what you have is, you've got the area, and I'll show you again so we can kind of go back into our text, but I really wanted us to get an understanding that to the Jews, they were not only physical half-breeds, they were spiritual half-breeds. They may do our practices, but they don't do them for the same reason we're supposed to do them. And to this day, there are Samaritans who are up on Mount Gerizim, and next week, I will try to develop the geography part of it. But they still sacrifice at Passover. They still kill lambs at Passover up on Mount Gerizim. So that's still a common occurrence. So let me show you again here, and I'll show you what the Jews would do as a result of it. So here is the whole property before, like during Solomon. That was the last king of the United Empire. And then here it is divided. So I did it like this. Maybe I spread it out. Let's go. Thank you, iPad. So you can kind of get the idea. And again, there it is here. Now what you have then is notice Samaria is in the middle. By the time of Jesus' day, this splits into three parts. You have the area of Judah. You have this area in the middle. Hello. You have the area in the middle that they would call Samaria. And then you have the area up here that we would, and again, I'm being very crude. There's a lot of other little things. But it'd be the area of Galilee. Now, as a result of that, because this area in essence was no man's land, what that meant is that any decent Jew, if he was from Galilee, he would skip to the other side of the Jordan River and come back around just north of the Dead Sea to go into Jerusalem for the 3 required feasts of the year. He would skip this area altogether. Does that make sense? Because we don't deal with those people. Now, even the way they dressed was different. To the Jews, they wore a lot of white, they wore a lot of lighter clothes, and they always wore their tzitzits. Tzitzits was the sort of tassels that hung at the end of things to show with blue thread, to show their allegiance to the commandments was the idea. And they always had the talit, their head covering as well. But they were basically, in the simplest sense, they kind of looked like people that were a little, they wore a lot of lighter clothes. They were more obvious. Is where the Samaritans, for the most part, wore colors very similar to these couches. To give you an idea, where they were much more they were the natural colors. In other words, if you will, the Samaritans shopped at the Gap, and where the other ones would have shopped probably someplace like Forever 21. Colors are much more bright. So.
Whoa, I didn't see it on there.
You didn't see me on there. Yeah. Okay. Now, are you all with me on that? By the way, this would add 2 days' journey to do that. You know what's interesting is Jesus never painted a Samaritan in bad light. If you think about it, Samaritans, when you think of a Samaritan, what's the first place you think of in the New Testament?
Samaria? The parable of the Good Samaritan?
The parable of the Good Samaritan. Yeah, right? Now, he is the most unlikely hero to a bunch of Jewish people. Now, we don't really have anything like that per se here. We might say the good Arab to some who still deal with great trepidation and fear over that. But to most of us, at least in California, we'd be like, well, but we don't really have anyone here. But you go back 50 years ago and you go to the Deep South, you could say, could you pardon me for saying, like the good black guy. That would have been, back then you might have said, 80 years ago, the good Negro, and they would have gone with that. They would have gone, what? No, not the case. But understand, there was a great deal of prejudice. Is that fair? So, but also, there were 10 lepers healed, by the way. And of the 10 lepers, only one comes back to thank Jesus, and happens to be a Samaritan. That's quite noteworthy. But to the religious leadership, they were very different about it. As a matter of fact, when they trash talk Jesus, they'll say, Isn't it right that we say that you are demon-possessed and are a Samaritan? That's trash talking Jesus. You want to really cut below the belt? That's the nastiest you can get? And you realize you could see why Jesus really brings up this story, and it would be really weird for us to hear about a good Samaritan. There's no such thing as a good Samaritan. For us, we almost go Samaritan. Well, isn't that the good guy? But it wouldn't have been to them. Now, again, all of this because going back into our text, because believe it or not, we need to, he says again, he left Judea and departed again to Galilee, but he needed to go through Samaria. So Jesus now was going through the area no decent Jew goes through. And I remind you, Jesus isn't going alone. He is going with his disciples. And it says in verse 5 that he came to the city of Samaria, which is called, and can you say Sychar? Oh, that was nice. Sychar. No, Sychar, by the way, like lots of places, is what happens when you leave the name of a town to evolve over years. Sychar was, going backwards, Sechem, and Sechem was Shechem. So Sychar was Shechem. Now it tells us, near a plot of ground that Jacob gave to his son Joseph. Now I want to remind you, before there were ever Samaritans, Israel was there. Before Israel as a divided country was there, Jacob was there, the father of Israel. And not only was he there, he actually bought property there. For what it's worth, in Genesis 33:18, we will actually read that he bought a parcel of land where he pitched his tent from the children of Hamor, Shechem's father, for 100 pieces of money. It'll tell us in Joshua 24 that after Joseph had died, he actually made them promise that they would take his bones back, and they buried him right there. So this is an area, by the way, which tells me where we're at. And what that tells me is this Shechem, which I'll develop next week, comes to the area of a well, and this well we actually know. We can find this well today, and for what it's worth, it happens to be 10 feet wide, and it happens to be 11 stories deep. That's a deep well. Now, with all of that, it tells us that Jesus is there by a plot of ground, and it says in verse 6 that Jacob's well was there. Jesus, therefore, wearied from his journey, sat by this well. It was the 6th hour. Now, the Jewish day starts at 6 a.m. So you have to count. You add 6 to 6 a.m. What time is that? Yeah, it's noon. So it is noon now. Jesus is at the hottest time of the day in Israel. I've learned from most places between noon and 1, it's the hottest time of the day. Unless you're in England, for whatever reason, it's like 3, 4 p.m. But here it's that. Now, I won't say this and I won't develop this, but I'll put this bug in your ear for a future time. There are 3 times of prayer. It goes all the way back to Daniel. If you remember, Daniel was so righteous that the people who hated them, they're like, the only way we could actually get this guy trapped is to actually outlaw prayer. Because this guy's going to pray 3 times a day, whether we like it or not. So they tried to outlaw him and they busted him on that. But those 3 times of prayer traditionally are the 3rd, the 6th, and the 9th hour. And each one of those, for what it's worth, the Shacharit and the Mincha and the Ma'ariv. Now, for each of those, there's a specific theme. That 3rd hour of the day, by the way, and I remind you, that would be 9 a.m., you would be actually saying, God, and the theme primarily is God give. That's, by the way, I actually do this in my own prayer life. We wake up in the morning and I'm like, Lord, we love you, we thank you, and we know there are things that are going to be needed for this day. We need a fresh filling of your Holy Spirit. We pray for the health and the wisdom and the clarity that's going to be to live out this day, and the sustenance in whatever ways you need, the resources. At noon, or the 6th hour, they pray in the simplest sense is God speak. God, now speak to me. I'm setting aside time now just to listen. And then at the 9th hour, they would be praying, God save. Now, interesting, look in the New Testament at how many things are listed at the 3rd hour, the 6th hour, the 9th hour. Listen, God give, God speak, God save. Can you just try that with me? God give, God speak, God save. At the 3rd hour, for what it's worth, the Holy Spirit is poured upon 120 people praying in an upper room. Interesting. In Acts chapter 2. Third hour, what are we praying on that third hour? God give. At the sixth hour, Peter is praying in Acts chapter 10. And God shows him the bug and beast buffet, if you remember that. And he says, don't call unclean what I've made clean. And at the sixth hour, what are we praying? God, speak. Interesting. At the ninth hour, Cornelius gets told to go and call for Peter so that Peter can come and share the gospel with him. And at the ninth hour, you're praying, God, save. For what it's worth in that, it also tells us when Jesus was crucified. And it tells us that when Jesus was crucified, it was dark between the sixth hour and the ninth hour. And at the sixth hour, Jesus begins to speak those 7 statements, we would say the 7 statements on the cross. So you kneel down and you pray, God, speak, and he speaks these. When does Jesus die? At the ninth hour. And what are we praying? God save. Well, there's a whole lot more of those, but I thought I'd put that bug in your ear. Here's what we have. At this point, a woman is going to a well, and if the woman is going to a well, it's the sixth hour. What are we praying at the sixth hour? Excellent, yes, God speak. And that's what's going to happen. So the woman comes, in verse 7, she comes to draw water, and Jesus says, give me a drink. And we're only going to go as far as verse 9 right now, because it's just too much fun, and I don't want your brains to explode. But hear me in this. The woman of Samaria comes, and we'll develop more about her next time. But Jesus speaks to her, and he says, give me a drink. Now, here's a guy sitting at a well, and traditionally Jewish men didn't speak to any woman in public but their mothers. Did you know that? They couldn't even speak to their wives in public. But here's a guy, and by the way, it does tell us that, notice in verse 8, that Jesus has sent his disciples away to go buy food. Now, every good Jewish boy avoids Samaria. Jesus takes him into Samaria. Later on, by the way, in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus will try to go through Samaria, and the Samaritans won't let them in another area of Samaria. And it is John and James who would say, do you want us to call fire down on these people? That tells you their attitude about the Samaritans. But imagine, if you will, Jesus takes his disciples into Samaria, and then he goes, now all y'all need to go buy food. Which one of you wants to go to Samaria to buy food? To go to the Samaritan store when you would never go to Samaria? But you can see sometimes Jesus needs to get you out of the way so that he could actually do what he wants to do. And in this case, he needs to deal with a girl with a broken heart. So, it is now, it's noon, and this woman shows up there, and there's a man at the well. Talk about that more next time. And with that, he says, give me a drink. Now, it is imperative to recognize that in Hebrew, a statement and a question are only differing by their inflection. We have word count, like we have words like why and so forth. But traditionally, it's like, are you going to the store? You're going to the store. But in Hebrew, you'd say, you're going to the store? You're going to the store. The only difference is your inflection. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Now, how do I know that she takes this as a question? Look at verse 9. The woman of Samaria said to him, how is it that you, being a Jew, ask a drink from me? She saw it as a question. Did you see that? So it wasn't like Jesus went, woman, give me a drink. So he says, will you give me a drink, please? Jesus has sent away his people. He's weary and he's thirsty physically. And he meets a woman who was weary and thirsty spiritually. He says, will you give me a drink, please? And she says, how is it that you even address me? Remember, we'll take it to high school politics here, and then we'll go to the rest of this next time. But there are the popular kids in school, and there are those who aren't so popular in school, who will tell you that they hate the popular kid in school. But the reason they hate the popular kid in school is because they're convinced that the popular kid in school hates them. Does that make sense? And the only kind of way to save any face is to kind of go, well, I hate them too. By the way, it's interesting, because you'll find that happens in a lot of places in the world. For instance, in a lot of places in the Middle East. Oh, we hate Americans. That's funny. You're wearing Levi's. How badly do you hate America? You'll take American dollars. That's a little strange to me. It's like it's the kind of kid that you wish you could be that kid, but you hate him because you can't. And the reason I say that is the popular kid in the social structure is the Jew talking to somebody that's the castaway. But beyond that, a woman, she doesn't even bring that up here yet but she starts she leads with Samaritan and then goes to woman. So he's like, how is it that you of all people would talk to me, a Samaritan and a woman? Because Jews do not deal with Samaritans. Now, hear me as we go to prayer on this. There are places when you follow Jesus that he's going to lead you to go to that you're just going to have to go. You need to go. You will not want to go. Because if you wanted to go, you wouldn't have to need to go. And he's like, I have an individual that has a broken heart. And they are suffering, and they are desperate, and they are dying of thirst. And I want you to meet that need. I want you to go there, and I want you to meet him. And you're like, nope. I'll go anywhere but there. Anywhere but there, Lord. Anyone but them. Because it's not just a there, it's a them for Jesus here, isn't it? It's like of all the people, not that one. And of all the places, not there. Now, I'm not asking you, go and throw yourself, in the middle of Compton, indiscriminately, wave your wallet and start telling people, I'm here to meet with someone. Well, you'll definitely meet with someone. But I've learned when you follow the Lord, he's going to take you to places you would never go elsewise. And you would fight him even wanting to go. But when you go there, the whole life is going to be changed. Interesting, in Acts 1, when Jesus says the Holy Spirit will come upon you and empower you, he says you will be witnesses, martyrios, literally evidence, in Jerusalem, Judea, all Judea, Samaria, and then the ends of the earth. Interesting, that's the route Jesus takes. He was in Jerusalem, then he went to Judea, up beyond that, and then from there he went to Samaria. That's his route here. But you know what's interesting is, what appears to be perhaps the largest revival of a community, because we can argue in Acts chapter 2, but that's a convention, happens to be Samaria. In Acts chapter 8, Philip the evangelist goes there, and it seems like the whole city gets saved. Well, where were they primed? They were primed right here because Jesus met with a single gal, who, by the way, will become the first Samaritan evangelist. Now, here's the crazy part. This could be you. You could be this woman at the well, where you know what it's like to have tried and have tried and tried and have it not meet you. And you are disenfranchised and you're disillusioned and you're broken because of it. But for a woman that we're going to learn has had 5 husbands and now she's just living with a guy, she is the lowest because she's a Samaritan. She's lower culturally. I'm not telling you it's right because she was a woman, but she was also a woman that's had 6 husbands, and now she's just living with a guy, which, by the way, isn't accepted in Samaritan culture either. She is the reject of the reject of the reject of the rejects. She is the complete opposite of the religious rock star that Nicodemus was in the previous chapter. God has given us the bookends to show you fit somewhere in here. So you're not going to be excused from this. Please, please, please hear me as we go to prayer. God does house calls. And there are some people that they need house calls. It seems like the only person ultimately, and then he'll leave after this. By the way, there was also another guy cutting himself with stones and howling and screaming, running around naked in the tombs, in a place no good Jew would go either, the area of the Gadarenes. Jesus did a house call for him too. Which one of you would go there? And go, not that person. That person's crazy. That person's uncontrollable. That person's out of control. And I would say, look, don't go unless the Lord lead you. But if the Lord lead you, he's going to do it. And he's going to shout down all of hell's army in front of you. And we've watched that. We've watched God save people that would call themselves direct descendants of Muhammad, whether they are or not, I don't know. And then our neighbors freak out. And they're like, oh, you can't do that because now they're going to bomb us. Look, the person's saved now. We've watched people that were virulent anti-Christian people give their life to Christ. And I look and I think there is no person out there that God can't save. Just whether they won't receive him. And I just want to pray tonight that if there is any prejudice, any place you'd say never there, or anyone that you would say never them, that God would rip that out of our hearts tonight. To be honest, that He'd just give us a bigger faith. A faith that would say, it's bigger than my understanding. I don't have to understand it to know that if He leads me, I'll follow Him. I found that people who have some of the greatest homeless ministry would be the last people you would expect to be out there doing that. There are people out there that have ministered to groups that they actually used to fight on. Classic example, of course, is the guy up in northern India. And I just want to pray that God would start ripping that away so that when we get to next week, it would just get deeper and more beautiful, and we would fall in love with the God who met you somewhere at your well. Will you pray with me? God, I want to thank you for this beautiful text. I want to thank you, Lord, for the way that you are starting to develop it. You are sort of laying things in place so that, Lord, next week when we go back to the Samaritan well, that we would see your brilliant love drawing us in. And I think how it seemed to me that Nicodemus seemed to know the where but not the how, and here's a gal that seems to think she knew the how but not the where, and she's going to grow to know you step by step. And in the beginning, all she sees is you're a Jew, Jesus. And I think, who would be amazed if we sat down and talked with them? Say, why would you talk to me? Lord, I pray that you would open our eyes, that what we could see is that people often who live some of the craziest lifestyles are just people starving for reality, starving for hope, and they're dying of thirst. They're spiritually dehydrated. And all they've been sold is more that which dehydrates them. And you promised us, Jesus, if we believed in you, out of us would fount living water. You'll tell her this here. And I pray, God, that we would trust you in that. So, God, I pray this week, especially as we get near that time, Lord, it's the holidays now, and there are going to be some people we're going to see that we wouldn't have volunteered for. Lord, I pray that we would be ready to offer, Lord, to those who even right now are living a life that just, in the simplest sense, displays that they've never met the living water. They've never encountered you, Jesus, and accepted your gift. Prepare us, Lord, that we would be ready. And that we would go, Lord, because you lead us. Where you lead us, and to whom you would have us speak with. To whom you would have us encounter. So, Lord, tonight, start ripping away that stuff and setting us free, God. And if forgiveness need be granted, give us the power to forgive. Lord, if they've injured us in some way, Lord, that doesn't mean we have to put ourselves in a place to be injured by them again. But, Lord, that we would be ready to share your transforming truth of how you died on the cross to save us and rose again to give us a new life. And we know that new life, Lord. May we be quick to offer it this Christmas season. In Jesus' name. Amen.